Liz Plank is a producer and host for Vox Media and the author of the book For the Love of Men, A New Vision for Mindful Masculinity. Earlier, I sat down with Liz to talk about why she wrote this book and the idea that men constantly feel a need to prove their masculinity. So you call your book, For the Love of Men, a love letter to men. What motivated you to write this?
Well, I just, through a lot of reporting and a lot of research and talking to a lot of men, I realized that there was a lot of pain that wasn't being explored in our, popular culture, in our mainstream conversations around gender equality, but also amongst men themselves. So a lot of men that I spoke to had never been asked questions about their masculinity, about what it meant to be a man, about who taught them what it meant to be a man, and if they feel like they're achieving that they have to, prove their masculinity constantly. And
was
and
it
what that
difficult
does.
for you to get them to open up about stuff like this?
I think that because I came in with questions rather than the answers, I think that they did really open up to me, but it shocked me. It really surprised me that they would talk about this to a total stranger, and when I would say, has anyone, have you ever talked about this with anyone before? Usually the answer was no. And so that's when I realized that there was just a huge blind spot when it came to our conversation around gender, where there's a big conversation around how we need to support girls and how we need to raise girls, and how we need to protect them from certain messages out there, certain ideals that are just not achievable.
Well,
there isn't that same conversation with
you
boys.
talk about how we had the feminist revolution in the 70s, but we haven't had something similar for men. A lot of women would say, well, why is that necessary? I mean, the reason it was necessary to have a feminist revolution in the 70s is that women were left out of so many things. Men never had these problems, right? This is what some women might say. So why do you feel it's necessary that we have a sort of a male revolution as well?
Right. And the feminist revolution is not over, and me writing this book, I know some people might perceive this as me saying, well, now women are fine, we don't even need to talk about them. Of course, I'm deeply interested in the lives of women and equality for women, but I think that it's a myth to think that there is a gender war, to think that if women aren't free, then men are free, or if we put any kind of attention to men and boys and making them more free of gender, that somehow we're taking away from women. Actually attending to the pain of men and the pain of boys in our society is the most productive way, I believe, to solve a lot of women's problems. And that's what I became really frustrated by. I would be in these rooms, I'd be in these panels, I'd be in these amazing conversations where it was all women, and we were talking about things like domestic violence, we were talking about things like mass shootings, we were talking about sexual violence, about rape on campus. These are all issues that affect women, but not having men inside the room in those conversations, it means that we will never actually solve those problems. And including men in an empathetic way, in a way where we're not ranking our oppressions, right? We're not saying, well, women have it worse, so you can't speak. You can show up, but you have to shut up. I don't think that that's a productive way to build a movement. And shame is a deeply corrosive emotion. Shame is at the core of, I believe, most of our social ills.
So you link that feeling to sort of a hyper masculinity that can in turn lead to violence.
Yeah, so what happens, Brene Brown studies shame and is the foremost expert on shame, and she talks about female shame and male shame as operating differently. So female shame tends to be, I'm not perfect, right? I'm not the perfect mom, I don't have the perfect body, I'm not the perfect girlfriend, I don't have the perfect hair. And for men, it's a little bit different. It's usually having to pretend that they're not weak, having to hide any kind of weakness, and that any kind of weakness means that there's something wrong with them. So they are very often, at very young age, they're called the F word, they're called gay, which is equivalent with being weak, or being feminine, which again is deeply rooted in misogyny and a hatred of women. There's nothing wrong with women. What would be wrong with a man acting like a woman? But so there's a lot of gendered policing happening from an extremely young age for young boys, and what they learn is that there's a part of them that is not acceptable. There is a part of them that's broken, and that they must hide from everyone in their lives, or else they will not be accepted, they will not be loved, and that is a part of them that's not lovable.
And it seems that it's less of a problem for little girls to act like boys, right?
Yeah.
A tomboy is much more accepted than a little boy who wants to, play with a toy kitchen and sew his own clothes,
yes.
right? So do you think that is simply because as a society we prefer masculine values to feminine ones?
Absolutely. I mean, right? It's deeply rooted in sexism, and it's also proof that misogyny and sexism hurts everybody, right? That it hurts women, obviously, when we devalue anything that's feminine. But it also is difficult then for men who want to show empathy, who want to show, lead with collaboration. So I, as a woman, have been encouraged, especially in the last few years, with a lot more attention to women in the workplace, particularly, to assert myself, right? To display more masculine features, quote unquote, in traditional masculine features of confidence and assertiveness. But we're not encouraging men in the workplace, particularly, if you want to use that example, to display more female characteristics, which are actually really great for our society, right? No one ever has said, my boss is way too empathetic, right? Or my boss wants to collaborate way too much. These are really great qualities, and so we're pressing them from a very young age.
Right.
And boys, whether it's through not being able to wear pink or not being able to play with a Barbie doll, all of these things basically give them the message that they have to prove constantly that they are men and that there's nothing feminine about them. It's just a shame because I think that it really denies the potential of women in our society, but it also denies the potential of men because they can't reach their full potential, right? There are full industries where, like nursing, like teaching, only 10% of teachers are men. So we are all losing as a society when we make up these rules about what is acceptable for a man and what is acceptable for a woman.
So Liz, you say that men are sometimes more vulnerable to this idea that they have to constantly prove their masculinity. Let's say a stay-at-home dad doesn't work outside of the home for some other type of job that's seen as less masculine.
Yeah.
Does that lead to any other aggressive behaviors to try and prove masculinity?
Yeah, so what we're seeing is a kind of compensation behavior when the masculinity is threatened for men, depending on, all the examples you cited are great. What we're seeing even in studies, some of my favorite studies actually are in this realm in the book. Men are more likely to eat twice as much pizza if there are women around to prove that they can eat more.
I've got a hearty appetite.
Yes, we all love a pepperoni breath. And there's a hand grip study that's very famous where some men were told that they were less strong than they actually were. So they had to hold on to something very, very strongly, and they were told, well, you did a little less well than the average. And men who were told that were more likely to engage in sexist behavior or to accept sexist behavior, and when they were asked about it later, they were more likely to deny wanting to use feminine products or anything that was pink, and they were actually more likely to lie about a very verifiable fact, which is their height. So they
were trying to compensate.
And say that they were taller than they actually were. And of course, these are trivial and kind of funny examples. But then what we're seeing is men who make less than their wives. For example, straight men who make less than their wives. Have actual health disparities compared to men who don't. So they are more likely to experience cardiovascular problems. They're more likely to have diabetes. So there are actually health risks when a man's masculinity is threatened. It can cause stress that we can see in literal health indicators. Yeah, and so and obviously it can lead to a lot of violence. So men who have baby faces are more likely to be violent. This is these are very this is data that's very sort of shocking and surprising. Yeah. But then it doesn't also surprise you, right? When you think about the men who in our society tend to be the most loud, that confidence is actually quiet and insecurity can be very loud. But we again as a society sort of or as a culture we believe that that's being a man, right? That taking up a lot of space, that driving a fairly fancy car, that's those are the real men, quote unquote. But actually it can be a form of compensation for feeling like you're not actually achieving that ideal.
It's interesting, especially in a part of your book, you talk about the way things like climate change are viewed, so that people who are very careful about recycling and the environment are viewed as more feminine.
It actually is seen in the data that we associate, all of us, by the way, it's not just men and women associate tote bags to be more feminine. And I actually had this conversation during an interview recently where this man who, again, is very progressive, has read the book, has thought about all these things, and he was like, I was going out on a day and I had a lot of stuff that I needed to carry around, like my phone charger and my shoes, and I was going to put it in a tote bag, and then I had this moment where I was like, wait, is it going to be like should I not, because it's too feminine? So it really impacts all of us. Tote bags are viewed more feminine. Recycling generally is seen in a more feminine way, and so what we're seeing is a literal recycling gender gap. So we're seeing that men are less likely to recycle because it doesn't align with the society's expectation.
That's crazy.
Of what men are supposed to do. And so this does have repercussions everywhere.
Right.
We have to give people some slack and have empathy for people in realizing that a lot of this is unconscious bias. But we can't tell people, well, if you've engaged in any kind of act of sexism or racism or transphobia, right, you can't be part of this club. I think that we have to admit that
we've all been complicit.
Exactly, we've all been complicit, and we can all work to change the system. And we're all doing the best that we can with what we've been given. We have to change what we've been given.
Liz Plank, thank you so much.
Thank
A pleasure
you.
talking to you.
Thank you so much.